Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the One Health Seminar Series. Please be aware that we are recording this seminar. The One Health Seminar Series is organized by the University of Guelph One Health Institute and graduate students enrolled in the One Health Collaborative Specialization. My name is Sarah Robinson, and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Pathobiology here at the University of Guelph, and I'm also one of the One Health students. It is my pleasure to be facilitating the first seminar of this academic year. With great respect, we acknowledge that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawaddarung people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish with the One Spoon Covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that this gathering place and the many places we are joining the seminar from this afternoon are today home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land where we explore, share, discuss, and learn, and our shared responsibility for human, animal, and environmental health. Before I introduce our speakers today, I wish to remind you that this seminar is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the One Health YouTube channel, and a link will be made available on the One Health Institute website. The recording may also be used by the One Health Institute in the context of promoting and showcasing One Health work being done on our campus. If you have any questions or concerns about the recording or One Health in general, please contact us at onehealth@uoguelph.ca. You can also follow the One Health Institute on Twitter. For the presentation today, we have enabled live captions. If you wish to see the captions, please click on the setting option as shown on the slide here at the bottom right of your screen and check the English option. And at the end of the seminar presentation, you will be invited to ask questions. As this is a Microsoft Teams live event, you will need to ask your questions through the chat function. To open the chat function, click on the Q icon at the top right of your screen. You will see the featured questions, those that we have published. If you wish to ask a question, click on My Questions and type your question into the box at the bottom of the screen. To ensure that everyone is familiar with the chat function and to help us know who is joining the seminar, I'd like you to please take a moment now to indicate if you are an undergraduate student, graduate student, faculty, or staff, and what department you are joining us from. If you are joining us from outside the University of Guelph, please tell us what your institution or organization is. You can go ahead and do that in the chat function. Hopefully no technical difficulties there, so wonderful. Thank you all for sharing. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Deborah Stacey is an associate professor in the School of Computer Science, College of Engineering and Physical Sciences. She is the principal investigator of the Guelph Ontology Team, GOT. This research group investigates the development, use, and analysis of knowledge engineering and machine intelligence techniques, particularly ontologies. The main theoretical research emphasis is on data-driven ontology evaluation and the development of ontologies for simulation parameters. Dr. Theresa Bernardo is a professor and IDEXX chair in emerging technologies and bond-centered animal healthcare in the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Guelph. She has worked with the United Nations and Inter-American Systems in health informatics and in academia. As leader of knowledge management and communications for WHO's office in Washington, D.C., she introduced the use of social media for disasters. And without further ado, our presenters.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah. I'm just going to pull up my presentation. Hello, everyone. I know many of you from the course on One Health Approaches to Research from last winter. Today, we're going to introduce the global burden of animal diseases, GBADs, and talk specifically about data resources and how the ability to combine different types of data will be essential for good One Health decisions. First, a bit of background. Let's say that after a successful career in the tech center, you're turning your attention to global health from the human perspective, and you have considerable resources at your disposal. Where would you start? The total annual expenditure on global health is $41 billion US. Canada contributes just over $1 billion, about 3% of the total, while the US spends $12 billion, or 30% of the total. So they are just about on par based on the size of their populations and economies. The Gates Foundation falls in between with a contribution of almost $4 billion, or 10% of the total. With a background in business and data, the Gates wanted evidence of where their investments would have the greatest impact. That's why the Gates Foundation provides about $30 million a year to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington, which produces the Global Burden of Disease, GBD. He uses their metrics to guide his investments in human health, including COVID. The GBD had its origins in a simple question: what are people dying from? Their output looks like this. In blue are the non-communicable diseases responsible for 7 out of 10 deaths globally, especially heart disease, stroke, and various cancers. The remaining 30% of deaths are due to infectious disease and nutritional deficiencies in red, and trauma in green. The Global Burden of Disease study was started by 2 researchers in the 90s and now involves over 3,000 collaborators. It's generated almost 20,000 peer-reviewed publications and has been cited over 700,000 times. It's a stellar example of what can be achieved by collaborating to solve big problems, by sharing data, and using it to prioritize concerted actions. As crazy as it may sound, before achieving consensus on the Millennium Development Goals in this century, the international development community measured their success by how much they spent on an issue rather than by measuring tangible outcomes. For example, they might say, we spent $4 billion on malaria this year, instead of saying, we reduced cases of malaria by 10%. And this new approach has carried on to the Sustainable Development Goals in place from 2015 to 2030. As One Health practitioners, we know that human health is just one part of the bigger picture. Progress has been made on the global burden of foodborne diseases and the global burden of crop loss. But today we're going to focus on the global burden of animal diseases, GBADs, which is linked to a number of the Sustainable Development Goals. There's interaction among the various global burdens, particularly related to the Sustainable Development Goals for food, but also affecting the SDGs for livelihood, for gender, and for the environment. Animals play many roles in society, but most notably as the sole source of livelihood for many small producers. What percent of the global population do you think relies solely on livestock? 5%? 10%? 20%? It's actually 12% of the global population, almost 1 billion people. Juanita is one of them. She relies on sheep in the Bolivian Andes. But that raises a question. If we were going to do a pilot as a proof of concept, what are the most important species? How might we decide? Based on the number of animals or on their value? And where would we find that data? If we look at meat production, the highest amount is from poultry, and that doesn't include the benefit of eggs. This visualization is from Our World in Data, using data from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. FAO's raw data is available to anyone to download. You can see the bulk download button in the bottom right corner. Dr. Stacey will be talking about different ways to access data. Based on the data, Bill Gates decided to pursue poultry, and for our pilot project, we decided to look at poultry in Ethiopia. Next, where can we find out what diseases and conditions affect chickens in Ethiopia? That sort of data is reported to the World Organization for Animal Health, or the OIE, which can be queried through an interface called WAHIS, the World Animal Health Information System, which is currently being updated. Next, how can we measure success? We'll take the difference between where we are now and where we would be with optimal health. Going back to the GBD study in humans, they started by measuring deaths, but there are many other types of health loss that needed to be accounted for, and they needed to be able to compare estimates across countries, diseases, and over time. When they started the GBD, there was no comparable data available, and if you added up data for deaths caused by different diseases, it exceeded the total number by several fold. They adopted the concept of the DALY, or Disability Adjusted Life Year, which incorporates aspects such as early death, disease, and disability in a way that can be compared across countries and over time. Here you can see the global burden of disease measured in DALYs in 1990 and in 2017. You'll notice that the blue section, non-communicable diseases, has increased to account for over half of the losses. This is where we find ourselves with GBads. We have partial, incomplete information from cost-benefit studies that suggest a loss greater than reality. For GBads, the economists have put a lot of thought into what to measure and how to measure it. They're basically looking at expenditures at the current level of population, of production, where the ideal are, at the current level of production versus the ideal, or utopia, of what could be achieved with perfect health. They're calling this difference the health loss envelope, and will try to assign that amount to different diseases and conditions. For example, in dairy cattle, the health loss might be attributable to diseases such as foot and mouth disease and conditions like lameness or mastitis. The problem of our current use of economics in animal health is that it's used to demonstrate dramatic impact of specific diseases and for advocacy around their control. This means we have weak evidence for investment, we don't allocate our resources well, and we can't evaluate the impact of our investments. There are a lot of things to measure, and they fall into two general categories: the impact of disease and the impact of our reaction, including things like drugs, vaccines, or quarantines. I probably don't need to remind you that livestock and aquaculture also dominate our use of land and water and affect our air quality and climate change. This is the core GBads team, and this is the overall structure. The project has initial funding from the Gates Foundation, which is administered by the OIE in Paris. Jonathan Rushton, an animal health economist at Liverpool, is the program director. He's been the driving force for GBags. Deb Stacey and I lead the informatics theme in the middle, which cuts across all the other themes. We assembled an awesome team of experts, including veterinarians, epidemiologists, computer scientists, spatial analysts, and experts in knowledge management, who met in Greece last year, and in 48 hours we formulated a 5-year plan and a budget. Participants represented a mixture of private companies and NGOs on the left, universities to the right, with intergovernmental agencies in the middle. What we envisioned was not a static database, but a dynamic knowledge engine that's flexible and responsive in real time. We outlined 5 steps to get there. Starting with a report on best practices for knowledge engines based on 5 or 6 outside successful models, some of which have been suggested here. Our second output is mapping the landscape of existing data, including data quality and terms of access. A computer science graduate student, Cassie Raymond, started to document sources of global, continental, national, and project-level data relevant to poultry production in Ethiopia. There are derivatives of this data. Here we see data on poultry production in Ethiopia over time. And the private sector probably has the best data, but it comes with a separate set of issues, which Deb Stacey will explain. Our third output is cultivating an active community of GBads collaborators and users, and engaging stakeholders to specify use cases and priority functions. And lastly, to design and implement the knowledge engine itself according to the needs for customized knowledge products and services required by the GBads community. There's so much data from different sources of varying types and quality that can be a real challenge to make sense of it. But it This summer, we had a team of veterinary, computer science, and cybersecurity students looking at the accessibility and quality of existing sources of data and researching data security in the cloud to accommodate private sector data. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, hopefully, and turn things over to Deb.
All right, thank you, Theresa. I'm assuming my slides are up now. So Theresa gave us an overview of what GBADs is looking at. And one of the things that we're going to concentrate on is solving a problem like data. So the hills truly are alive with the sound of data. We have data everywhere in all different shapes and forms. And so we had to look at the problem of data sharing. So one of the underpinnings for economic modeling is having the appropriate data. But when we started looking at it, a lot of scientific projects are dedicated to using open data. And that's great if the data is open. But we also know that some of the best data for livestock production figures and even disease data may be held in commercial hands. And so it's private. So we have to look at, not only do we have to look at all the technology, which is why I'm here as a computer scientist, but we also have to look at all the ethics and the trust issues which the economists and epidemiologists bring to the project to make sure that people will want to share their data and we can have the best data around. So there's all sorts of different issues when you look at data. The first one is, can you find it? And while there is a lot of public open sources of data, they're not as easy to find as you might think, or there's not as many as you might think. And private sources are very opaque. It's very hard to find them. So if you can find them, we also have the problem, can you use them? You have to make sure you know the provenance of the data. Where did it come from? How did they gather it? Can you use it? And then if all of that is yes, 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 well then how do you get the data? How do you transmit it to where you want to use it? And if you don't have permissions, is there a way to get permission, or is there a part of the data that someone might feel comfortable sharing? And that we know in the commercial case, in the industrial case, this is what we're going to have to look at. So we have always this eternal battle between cats and dogs. No, open data and private data. So we have to look at how do we accommodate all of that. Well, if you actually go to Wikipedia, you'll see when they talk about data sharing, they only mention open data. And one of the sort of seminal papers, recent papers about data sharing in the scientific domain is called FAIR. So the FAIR Guiding Principles for Scientific Data Management and Stewardship. And they've set forward the principles, which is that it would be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to say to people, there's data out there, we should share it, but we have to have a mechanism for sharing it. So we have to obey certain principles, and that we have to make sure that all of this is ethical and open. And so they also set up, now this is very recent, there's something called GoFair, where they not only have the principles set out, but they're helping people figure out how do they actually make sure that their data is fair. So they look at creating metadata, because like our project, they understand that data has to be machine to machine usable. So a lot of times when you go to the internet and you go to a website and you look at it, you're in the process, you're a human being, you're picking and choosing and moving around and making decisions. But when we want to do these complicated models and evidence-based decision systems and all of these knowledge engines that we want to create, the problem is that you need the machines to talk to each other. It's too slow to have a human in the loop. So they look at helping people create metadata for their community. They look at various implementation choices so that they can help people actually set up data sets and to make sure that they can reuse the principles, implementation principles that other people have come up with. And they have a guide about how to actually set this up in infrastructure, so how you can configure data points so that eventually what they foresee is a global internet of fair data and services. But they're still, for the most part, talking about open data. We actually have looked at, in some of the research we did this summer and presented at a Big Ag Data workshop, is actually amending fair to fairs, and that's to put security in. Because then we were lucky. We had two cybersecurity masters in cybersecurity students, Kenneth Wolf and Nidip Shakalia, and we looked at how can you make the system secure enough that a commercial entity would actually share data, not openly, but they would share it in a way that they felt comfortable and which had purpose and usefulness to other people. And so we came up with a set of principles that I won't bore you with, but it's basically that when you design the system, you have to make sure security's there in case you're going to be putting in some data that has to be carefully managed. And actually, that was good because we're going to see another set of principles that needs that. So we also looked at how it could be implemented, and we have a paper coming out hopefully in the next year, which will talk about how we foresee this being implemented. But as I mentioned, the difference between open and private data is not as black and white as you might think. There's another set of principles that are called the CARE principles. And this is set up by a global indigenous data group that is looking at how they would like their data to be handled. And with GBADs, we know that eventually a lot of this data is going to come from the farmer, a small household that is interacting with livestock, and they're going to provide data, but they're going to want to trust. They're going to have to trust us, and we have to generate that trust. And one of the things is to look at what indigenous peoples want how they want their data to be handled. And so they came up with the CARE principles for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And I'm just going to go over them very briefly because they're quite complex. But with collective benefit, the idea is that data isn't there for data's sake. It's there for people to derive data from. And indigenous people who are responsible for collecting the data, or the data comes from their land or their communities, they want to have benefit from all of this. They don't want you just collecting data and making it open for the sake of it. They also want the authority to control this. So this is where the sharing and trust and the sort of not quite open part of the data sharing comes in, because while they want people to help them use the data and they want to help in research and in governance using this data, they also want to make sure that their rights and interests are recognized and that they can talk about the governance of the data in their terms, not just in the terms that scientists have put out. So there's a bit of conflict between FAIR and CARE. And we hope FAIRs will help bridge some of these gaps. So there's also the responsibility. If you're going to use data that is coming from Indigenous peoples, or is going to benefit or impact Indigenous people, then you have to form a positive relationship. And you can't just form a relationship with the data, you have to form a relationship with the people that the data impacts. And so you want this to be positive, and you want to build capability and capacity on all sides. And you also have to look at how you can incorporate Indigenous languages, cultures, worldviews, which often are left out. If you look at a lot of the international organizations, when they publish in different languages, it's never in Indigenous languages. And so if Indigenous peoples are going to control the data and control the impact of the data, this has to change. We have to think about this. And obviously this comes down to ethics. We have to minimize harm and maximize benefit. And this is exactly what we're looking at with the sustainable goals for the UN's goals. We have to look at making sure that data is used responsibly and that we know the community, we know where it comes from, we know the provenance, and we know the impact, what it's going to do to all stakeholders in the system. And since GBADs is going to be looking at an international audience, obviously Indigenous peoples are involved. So once you actually go through this minefield of trust and you establish positive relationship, how do you get the data? What do you do with it? What form is it in? Well, we went through the summer of trying to explore this. And so I'm going to look a bit at, what's usually what you get nowadays, which is being able to, which is a good thing, downloading files. We're going to look at when things aren't quite as good. We're going to look at scraping, which is as bad as it sounds. And we're going to look at what the future is. And this is not to say that it doesn't happen now, but this has to become ubiquitous, and that's APIs. And so I'm going to talk about what they are and how they work, because it's a very geeky thing, but they're also very luscious. And so I want to explain to you why they're so luscious. So if we, Theresa had shown a few of the sites that you find where you can get data from around the world. This is an OECD, FAO, agricultural outlook where you have all sorts of data. They have a little tab in there that says export. If you click on that, it'll say, well, you can get a file, you can get a CSV, they have different formats. You have to worry about all the formats and what all the columns are called and everything like that, but you can download the entire file. And so if we look at that file that I downloaded, I chose to get it in CSV, comma separated values. I'm sure everybody is familiar with this because there's so much spreadsheet love that is around. Everybody loves spreadsheets, it seems. So you have this table of values at the top in teal. I have what the columns are called. And then I've highlighted one of the pieces of data. Like Theresa said, we're interested in chickens in Ethiopia. And so this is looking at how many chickens were in Ethiopia, live animal stock in 2005. There's other formats, and of course you have to be you have to keep up with all of the different formats because they give you different things. So we have some people may be familiar with JSON or seen that on a site when they went there and asked you, do you want it in JSON? And it's like, what the heck is that? It's just a little bit more verbose. It's easy for humans to read and write. So I've got an example here of that same line that I had in highlighted in yellow. We've got the various column names in there as these quoted little elements, and then what their values were. And while it's easy for humans to read and write, it's also easy for machines to read and write or parse and generate. And so this is used in a lot of systems. And this is really good if you can go to a site and get this data and manipulate it, but you can't always. And so there's scraping. So there's lots of data out there that's presented on websites or in files or in social media, and they're not set up to download anything. They're just there. And so if you want to get the data off of them, you have to do something called scraping. So we previously we looked at WAHIS, the interface for the OIE. And with this, I'm looking at that we're going to be looking at a single country in Africa, which is Ethiopia. I've asked for Newcastle disease. This is a chicken disease, and I want it between 2005 and 2020. And this is what I get back. I don't get any tab that says download it in some format. I just get this part in the middle. You could scroll to the right and see more of it. It gave you all the data, but that's very hard to read, not really all that human friendly, and it's not machine friendly. So just remember this, because I want to show you why an API is so luscious. So what is an API? Well, this is a very geeky thing. It's an application programming interface. It really is just a way that we can use the web and use the communication protocol, the transmission protocol that's already there, HTTP or HTTPS, to transmit data in very simple ways. We can get, put, delete, post, so basically read and write. You will often hear them called restful, that they're REST application programming interfaces. That just mean it has some properties that CS gates like, and it's mostly to do with how it's actually instantiated. But they're great because you can have devices there, you see, like a phone or a web browser, and they can give commands to a server using a URL, and it gives them back the data. So why do we love them? They're simple to build and adapt for geeky types. They don't use many resources. They have high performance over a lot of other protocols. No new protocols had to be developed. It's piggybacking on something else. You can use all sorts of data formats. We can embed them in scripts, so we can make machines talk to machines, and we can also put them in something called a software development kit, so that they can be called in a way through a program, and so we really can have machine to machine, so humans don't even have to be involved at all with the data coming in to their simulation or their program. So at the bottom here, I want to show you what our just baby API that we have for our GBads portal. You can see in the blue, we've got something that looks like a website URL, and then after that we have some other things where we've got year start, year end element, and you can see that it's in this case 2005, 2018, and it's Newcastle disease. So we've scraped the data from the OIE, and our site can give you this information. And because it's coming back through a web browser, I can also use a plugin that recognizes that what I got back was JSON. And JSON, as you saw, was pretty ugly to look at. You could read it, but it was ugly and long. And so it formulated, oh, look, as a table. It's almost like a spreadsheet. It's beautiful. So it's actually really nice. You can manipulate all sorts of things. And that was done very easily machine to machine. This is the team that worked on it. Theresa talked about them before. We have a tiny little prototype data portal set up that people can go to. And when you see the URL, when it has the :8050, this will actually go and access our data. So if you do that, if you go there, we have an example of what is possible to set up through APIs, through all sorts of different Python programs in the background. What you're seeing here on the left is data from the FAO, and data on the right is from the OIE. And so you'll see it's plotting out. It's much easier to read than a lot of the other ones. You can do all sorts of things. We're getting the data. One of them we scraped, one of them we accessed from their site. If we scroll down that screen, it'll show the numbers for this, and you can see that's coming out as a CSV. You can download that. You could also ask for it in JSON. Right now it's not downloadable, but it will be within days. And you can also go down and get the API call that generated that data. So you could cut and paste that into a browser or a script or whatever, and you could use that to get the data to your program or your presentation or whatever you wanted it for. So we're working on that now this fall with some of the same students to try to improve that, get more data in there, so we have a fully functioning Ethiopian poultry site. And so this brings us to the end, where what we're trying to do is really, we saw this Utopia idea of figuring out Utopia for health, the health loss envelope. But what we want to do is have a data Utopia, where we have one-stop shopping for all of the modelers and decision makers, that we're going to provide open and private data, because we're going to look at security, and that to many applications, because it's going to be machine to machine, and users, because we'll have fancier data sites like that where you can go and browse and before you shop, and you can do this all so that you can provide and facilitate ethical, evidence-based decision making to support the sustainable development goals. So thank you very much, and I think now it's time for questions, and I will stop sharing.
So thank you very much for that, but also for your presentations, Theresa and Deborah. Now I'd invite all of our participants to use the chat function to publish your questions for our speakers. And so we have one from Sydney. Great presentation. Do you have any target decision makers or stakeholders in mind when presenting your data/results from grads? If so, do you have any hopes for how they will use the information that you provide?
So I did send an answer to Sydney. There are going to be multiple stakeholders, but some of the primary stakeholders, especially immediately, will be the chief veterinary officers of each country, because they're the people that right now have to make decisions about disease control programs and how much they have to argue for resources for veterinary medicine and for animal health. So they're responsible for making these decisions, and hopefully this will help them. So in addition to the funding that we're looking for the GBADs Central and money that we think is on the way for some pilot work, there are individual countries that have said, look, we're interested enough in this to provide funding to do some of this ourselves. So we're looking at a number of countries that may have sort of parallel projects with us, looking at the total burden of animal diseases in their country.
I think the other thing that's important too is that with what we're looking at, we want a decentralized system, so that right now with some systems you have that the modelers present the results, and that's what basically people go to the sites to get, not the data or the methodology or anything, but just the results. And that can also be problematic in that a lot of times maybe an individual country or an indigenous group might want to do their own modeling. And so we also want to provide all the resources. So not just to our modelers that are part of our project, and we will be putting out their products and their models and everything like that, but also give all the stakeholders, whether they're an individual country, an indigenous group, a cooperative of farmers, they can get the appropriate tools, data, all of that, and they can do their own modeling. So they can put their own assumptions or whatever they want in there, and that way it's a little bit more reaching out to everybody to say, let's all work with it together, not just sort of a hierarchical view of top down.
And we're hoping that people, if they come up with a great visualization, they'll share it with other people that might like that. Mm-hmm. So we want to build a community of users around the data and what you can do with it.
Great, thank you so much. All right, we have another question. Are there any incentives for commercial farmers to share their data?
There are. The thing is that this is a huge issue. We presented in the summer to this big data for agriculture workshop, and there were farm groups there and farmers there. And a lot of the different production groups that are very involved with it because they want to understand what's going on. They want to understand the future. So they want to understand the genetics. They want to understand feed, all of this. And a lot of the equipment they have now automates the collection of this data. And so they want to get value added to this. If they're providing data, often they don't really know where it goes or who uses it. And so by, like if we can work with them or the commercial entities to make it far more transparent, not showing everything, not more open, more transparent about where everything's coming from, a lot of people can benefit for it. So there are reasons why farmers would share data.
And one of our GBADs members did a survey of the private sector, and the vast majority of them said that they would use the data. The difficult thing is getting the first ones to volunteer to share their data. But we have some potential lines there. We have some companies that are doing very interesting work with poultry and helping people analyze the data so they know where their problems are and they can make improvements. So what we have to look for are win-win-win situations, basically, so that everybody benefits.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. Do you have any recommendations for addressing research fatigue among Indigenous peoples involved in health research?
That's a great question. One of the things that we're trying for here, I know from other like syndromic surveillance work that a lot of times Indigenous groups feel like they're guinea pigs or they're being prodded all the time. You know, like we're observing them all the time as if they were lab rats. And that's actually what CARE, those principles are trying to address, that it's more coming from them, not us taking, but them telling us what they would like to share. So one of the things that we're doing this fall with Cassie Raymond, who's a master's, doing her master's in bioinformatics, she's helping us with coming up with data governance principles for the entire GBADs project, because we want to make sure that this is done in a way that's ethical, that it does take in not just fair, but care, that we actually do think about what happens to all of the different groups in the system. So that's one of the ways that we're going to do this, is by being very specific about how we collect data, what the provenance is, what the data governance is, so that hopefully then Indigenous groups will come to us, not us just going saying, give us your data, but us showing them the value proposition and doing that if they choose.
And we have a question from Brian at the International Animal Health and Food Safety. Is your team in Ethiopia linked to the thousands of tablets distributed to extension staff in Ethiopia for information sharing and data collection? How are you collecting community-based smallholder production and disease data in LMICs?
So I can start with that. We aren't officially launched yet, but what we're starting with is existing data that we can access. But we would like to be able to combine all levels of data, from the international organizations that's all available online down to the smaller producers. So we're certainly interested in looking at and partnering with all kinds of project work. And we have one that we've been in contact with. We don't have any people on the ground. We're working through others and working through groups that are on the ground, like ILRI, International Livestock Research Institute.
Yeah, it would be great if we actually, if you have information about this and contact, we'd love to look at this. We're starting out at the sort of the global level first to look at all the data sources that are out there, but we want to rapidly move to where we're taking in locally collected data from either research projects or like extension projects and things like that. We want to move to that, and that's why we're looking at right away looking at data governance and looking at security, so that hopefully we can have people trust that they could share this data. But if Brian, if you have someone that we should contact about this, that would be great, because this would help us show others in the project that this is a viable avenue to go down, because there isn't a lot of examples of this in the global burden of disease. That wasn't how it was done with people. They haven't integrated like Fitbits and Apple Watch Health on watches or anything. We haven't done that yet. So we definitely see that as the future. So that's where we want to go.
And I just mentioned that we aren't collecting data ourselves. We're leveraging data that's out there. And what we're trying to do, I mean, there's so much data, it's overwhelming. It's all very different. So it's a big challenge to figure out how to make it fit together and make sense of it. So that's where we're coming from, is there's more than enough data out there. How can we pull all these different sources and types of data together in a meaningful way?
Thank you both. Another question from Sydney. What health metrics are you capturing that best represent and or support environmental health integration with animal health in GBADs?
You want to do that one, Theresa?
I'm not reading the question. So I would say that would probably be a better question for one of the other themes. We have to kind of keep track of what everybody's doing, but our particular job is putting the data together. So we have groups deciding on ontologies, right? Because, you know, if you say poultry, does that mean chickens, or does it mean chickens and ducks and guinea hens? I mean, there are all kinds of different groups. Some are looking at the economics, some are looking at the ontologies, some are looking at priorities for health disease. So we are sort of sharing the wealth of all the issues and questions we have to deal with. And it's still very early days.
Well, thank you both so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. So again, I'd like to thank both our speakers for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I hope you all did as well. Before we end, I want to remind everyone that the next One Health seminar will be on October 7th at 12:30 p.m. Our speaker will be Dr. Gus Skorberg from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Guelph. And the title of his presentation is Philosophical Perspectives on One Health. Thank you again for joining, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you.